Good morning and welcome everyone to this Green Recovery Festival session, a spotlight talk and expert Q&A with Jonathon Porritt, brought to you by The Crowd. I'm Caroline McFarland, Director of Common Vision, host of The Crowd. For those of you who aren't aware of The Crowd and what we do, The Crowd is a network for business leaders to explore and exchange ideas on corporate responsibility, sustainability, and essentially the transition to a low carbon future. The Green Recovery Festival is our fortnight of talks, panels, and interactive sessions around how the COVID recovery can be aligned with the transition to a sustainable world. And we're absolutely delighted to be hosting such a wide range of topics and experts across this week and next. We've had some absolutely fantastic discussions so far, and I'm sure today is going to be fantastic as well. We're joined today with Jonathon Porritt, who is co-founder of Forum for the Future, a veteran campaigner, an eminent writer, broadcaster, and commentator on sustainable development. Jonathon first got involved with environmental issues in 1974. He was also director of Friends of the Earth and chair of the UK Sustainable Development Commission between 2000 and 2009. And he's just written a book. Hope in Hell was published in the summer and looks at how we can rapidly decrease emissions, lessen inequalities, and capitalise on this unique moment for change, ensuring a better world for all. And just before I hand over to Jonathon for his opening comments, I just want to thank our sponsors, the Charities Aid Foundation, ADNAMS, and the RIBA, without who we would not be able to run these kinds of events. So thank you so much. And if you'd like to find out more about sponsorship and partnership of the Crowd's events and COP26 related activities next year, do get in touch with myself or a member of the team. Right, so without further ado, over to you, Jonathon. I mean, this unique moment of change, it's definitely been a unique year. How do we use some of the opportunities and, I suppose, get over some of the challenges that we're facing at the moment?
Indeed. And thank you, Caroline. Delighted to be part of your festival this morning. It's a rich feast that you've provided your participants. Great lineup of people, and certainly very timely. And obviously I will touch a little bit on the most topical contribution to the debate about the green recovery in terms of the Boris Johnson 10-point plan announced yesterday. But I'll come back to that in a moment, because I think one needs to contextualize first what's going on right now. And at the start of the year, I was not exactly full of hope, but reasonably hopeful that governments around the world would understand that given the trillions of dollars that would need to be invested to ensure economic recovery in every country affected by COVID-19, I was reasonably hopeful that they would ensure that the lion's share of those recovery dollars would go simultaneously to promote low carbon prosperity and to drive us really aggressively towards this 2030 target that we all have, which, just to remind everybody, of course, is to halve our emissions of greenhouse gases by 2030, entailing an annual reduction of around 7.5% per annum for 10 years. And we've seen roughly a 7.5% reduction in emissions of greenhouse gases during 2020, during the year of COVID-19. Obviously, we do not want to have to drive an annual reduction of the equivalent size by an equivalently painful process, such as that we've gone through with COVID-19. The great thing is that we don't need to have an equally costly sacrifice imposed on people to achieve the same. In fact, it could be done completely differently. So that was the start of the year, coming out, of course, from a very positive year in 2019, when I think there was extraordinary amount of momentum building in the overall system, the presence of Extinction Rebellion, influentially, powerfully on our streets, the emergence of young people through the climate strikes, beginning to remind politicians of some of the deeper intergenerational obligations that they have to do a better job than they're doing at the moment. We ended that year on what I consider to be the highest note so far in the climate debate. And then, of course, that pretty much got put on hold through COVID-19, and people began to plan for opportunities then to come out of the COVID-19 through into 2021, relying on this notion of, as you put it, Caroline, alignment between recovery from COVID-19 and addressing the climate emergency. It's not really panning out terribly well, to be honest. If you look around the world, out of the 12 to 14 trillion dollars that it's now estimated will be committed to recovery programs of one kind or another, and we don't know what the full extent of that will be, by the way, certainly don't know what the full extent will be in the USA, for instance. If you look at what's been announced so far, the lion's share of that is still going to the industries, the sunset industries of yesterday, carbon intensive, extractive industries, essentially trying to prop up and sustain yesterday's economy. The balance is disputed according to which set of figures that you're looking at, but it's roughly 2/3 is going into yesterday's economy, and roughly 1/3 at best, is going into support for economic activity that can be said to be compatible with a low carbon trajectory. That's the best analysis I can offer you. There are other analysts who think it's significantly worse than that. And certainly the role of the central banks so far has been deplorable in terms of the loan and support packages that they've come up with. There's hardly any conditionality attached to the huge amounts of money which have been going out to maintain companies, existing companies in today's economy. Now, should we be surprised by that? Well, not really. I'm afraid, because we don't actually have a level of political consensus as to what this alignment would look like at the moment. And there are two big issues working against us. The first is what Mark Carney has very eloquently continued to refer to as the tragedy of the horizon. For all sorts of different reasons, we can see the difference now in very stark terms between the pandemic, the COVID-19 emergency, and the climate emergency. COVID-19 is seen to be absolutely of the moment. It is a burning platform, if ever there was one. It is a real and present danger that everybody gets, and everybody wants to see their governments do something about it. And the more they can do about it, the better. So the full apparatus of the state has been mobilized to minimize the damage, theoretically, to minimize the damage caused by COVID-19. And that will continue for the foreseeable future, to be honest. We're looking at that level of intervention through governments running right through till the end of 2021 and possibly into 2022. So that's what a real and present danger looks like, an emergency in everybody's daily lives looks like. The climate emergency is not perceived to be a real and present danger of that kind, certainly not by governments. It is, of course, increasingly by more and more climate scientists, let alone climate activists, but governments don't see it that way. They still think that they've got time to do what they need to do, that they don't have to press an emergency button now. They love doing all this stuff geared towards 2050, the most lethal date, by the way, in the calendar of any human being alive today is the convenience of 2050. It is a desperate trap that we've got ourselves into in thinking that a net zero outcome by 2050 is the best that we can hope for. If it is the best that we can hope for, there is nothing to hope for. So the difference between the two emergencies is very, very clear and very stark. That's the first problem we're facing. The second is the problem of incumbency, and let's not beat around the bush here. Most governments today are still pretty much in hock to big business interests that have flourished during this period of economic expansion, or the growth that we've had, if you like, over the last 70 years. And many politicians owe their political careers to support from, active or indirect, from those industries. I think we see that at every turn, but particularly in America. And it isn't just the support that politicians get in practical terms, it's the contamination of their brains that has been going on for decades. These are not free agents. When I think about the thinking apparatus of most politicians today, I'm sorry to say that these are very limited organisms. They really can't grapple with the fact that some, at least, of their active life as politicians, what's left of them, will take place without this extraordinary central role of the fossil fuel companies in their midst. They just can't do that. They actually do not subscribe to the notion that the future of humankind depends on a world without fossil fuels and without these massively powerful companies in our midst, subverting and corrupting pretty much every process that you care to contemplate for a better world for people. So the combination of the tragedy of the horizon and the power of incumbency interests means that the recovery process so far, 9 months into the pandemic, is really pretty patchy at best. Is that likely to change? Well, there are good signs, of course. We actually have seen much greater purpose coming from some governments, and I think people rightly cite what is going on in Germany and France with much more ambitious recovery programs geared to different aspects of the green economy. The EU's own next generation recovery program is reasonably ambitious, but got marked down, as it were, during the negotiations. So it's less ambitious now than it started out as, but it's not bad. Elsewhere, it's hard to find real leadership coming from government. What that means, of course, is that more and more people are looking to business to see what the ambition level is like for those companies that are on the cutting edge of the climate debate. And it has to be said, in that regard, 2020 has been pretty amazing. I mean, I can't any longer keep track of the number of climate commitments that have been made by different companies all around the world over the course of the last 9 months. The pandemic has not in any way slowed that level of commitment. And I think in some respects, it's enhanced it. It's actually accelerated it. I think these commitments are for real. I don't detect significant signs of institutionalized greenwashing. I think an awful lot of companies now really do understand that the future of our economies and therefore of their prospects is dependent on ensuring that we can generate that prosperity without any of the, well, without many of the externalities that our current wealth creating model generates. So for me, there's a lot to be said about that corporate commitment, and it's a really significant part of it. All the more problematic, therefore, that the pressure from and the growing interest of companies in a proper, fully fledged green recovery does not really seem to be landing with this government here in the UK. I've looked at so many statements of support from the CBI to the Institute of Directors through to different engineering organizations, retail organizations. There was even a big thing out yesterday from the advertising industry talking about advertising for a net zero carbon world. Wow, now we're into some really interesting, surreal stuff. But you look at it just one after another, presumably landing up on the desk of Alok Sharma and presumably being taken on board to one degree or another, but one really does wonder how much. There was a time when government, recalcitrant ministers, were able to point to the opposition and obstructionism of business in this agenda as a reason for them not doing anything. That has gone pretty much entirely. So why is it that yesterday, when Boris Johnson announced his 10-point plan, why is it that we ended up with a real dog's dinner? I'm sorry, I know a lot of people have been quite positive about what happened yesterday with the 10-point plan. I do not know why. I'm not even sure they've really read it in any degree of detail, because when you really deconstruct it properly, you have to be clear about the things that are really good, and then you have to be clear about the things that are really worryingly bad. So let's bank the good stuff to start with. And the good stuff is the date to phase out petrol and diesel engines by 2030. That is undoubtedly a really big commitment. It puts the UK in the leadership cohort of countries that are seeking to move as fast as possible to electric vehicle substitutes for the internal combustion engine. Hybrids will continue until 2035. That's fine in my book. It'll allay some of the fears that people will continue to have through the decade about whether or not EVs will do what they need their vehicles to do. and a consultation launched at the same time on heavy goods vehicles, which is also significant. That's been backed up by around, if you do the figures, around £2 billion of support for EV infrastructure and grants for people wanting to purchase electric vehicles. Not insignificant, in fact, really quite important. Combine that with the money that the government has made available for variations on the active travel fund, helping cities and towns in particular to reduce dependence on the motor car, improve public transport, improve facilities for pedestrians, cyclists, et cetera, and that's quite a big chunk of money, by the way, which is now being rolled out. And you've got a really viable proposition. It stacks up. It's as good as anything that you could possibly expect from a government that has primarily been completely obsessed with the car, internal combustion engine, as any other government in the Western world. It's good. Let's bank that. And we're banking the 40 gigawatts of offshore wind, because we've had that announced on 5 separate occasions. So I presume we've already got that one stored away. That's it. Honestly, that's it. Pretty much everything else is a real mishmash of half-hearted and half-thought-through ideas. And some things are actually going backwards. So the complete foundation of any properly thought-through green recovery program is energy efficiency. I know it doesn't get its time in the limelight, but boy, does it deserve it. And the announcement that was made about this yesterday was astonishing, and I don't know why so few commentators have picked up on this. This was actually going backwards, not forwards. When the Green Homes Grant was announced earlier in the year, it was claimed that it would create 140,000 new jobs by April next year. Boris's latest opinion on this is that it'll create no more than 50,000 jobs by April next year. And there's been an announcement that the scheme, Green Home Scheme, will now be extended through to the end of March 2022. So 1 extra year, for which £1 billion has been allocated. This is so inadequate, it's hard to know where to start, particularly given that the Conservative Party itself, in its manifesto, election manifesto in December 2019, committed £9.2 billion to getting to grips with this issue of poor quality housing in the UK, addressing fuel poverty over a period of time. And the problem about this for a lot of people, especially those who work in the construction industry or the built environment in general, is these short-term measures have become so discredited that there isn't going to be any take-up of this kind of approach to dealing with our housing challenge and housing issues in this country. So you can forget that one. A little bit about green hydrogen, well, good. If you actually deconstruct the amount of money that is put on the table for green hydrogen, which is about 500 million, half of that will go to improve some of the production facilities, electrolysis plants that we need, not bad. The rest is all a kind of smokescreen about a hydrogen neighborhood, a hydrogen village, a hydrogen town. This doesn't mean anything. It really doesn't. And I do, but completely by chance, happen to know a tiny bit about this, as the university of which I'm Chancellor, Keele University, has got a full-blown active research project going on now, looking at the complexity of injecting hydrogen into today's gas grids. Those are just pipe dreams. This is sort of Boris smokescreen that amounts to absolutely nothing if you look at the hard engineering science of this. And we shouldn't be using hydrogen in our gas grid because we're going to need all that green hydrogen. Boy, are we going to need a lot of it to be doing the hard to abate sectors, particularly steel, cement and shipping. And that should be the priority for any additional green electrons that we have over from sorting out our electricity needs. This is a paltry sum of money anyway. I mentioned France and Germany before. Both of those countries have committed around 7 billion euros to green hydrogen investment over the course of the next decade. Our little piffling 500 million will just disappear into nothing. Carbon capture and storage, back there again. If you're really kind, you can stack the proposed investment back up to £1 billion, which was first promised more than a decade ago, promised again 7 years ago, and promised again 3 years ago. So we're back to the same billion that has been on the table for more than a decade. Meaningless. Nuclear, forget it. I'm happy to come back to that if you really want to. but honestly, it doesn't amount to much, which personally I'm absolutely delighted about, because we do not want any nuclear in our green recovery mix. The nature commitment, what did we get trotted out again? 30,000 hectares of trees to be planted. No action planning around that. No organization as yet involved in the detailed planning, which will be necessary to get 30,000 hectares of trees planted. And of course, because this would be far too creative and useful, no reference to the fact that the one thing which would make a real difference in the UK on climate-based, nature-based solutions to climate change, which is to stop all further development and burning of our peatlands, our peat bogs in this country. No mention of that, of course, because guess what? Incumbent interests wouldn't like it. If you're still in hock with those people who think that shooting grouse is just about the acme of civilized behavior, you're not going to take too kindly to a government that stops you burning your grouse moors. Now, I'm being harsh, but I'm being harsh deliberately, because I can't believe how complimentary a lot of people have been about this. This was a wish list, not an action plan. This spoke to a government that is still completely incoherent in terms of what the proper combination of short-term, medium-term, and long-term planning would actually look like. It in no way puts us on a trajectory to a halving of emissions by 2030. It in no way constitutes a proper leadership proposition as president of the COP26 process. So inevitably, significant disappointment, which is where I suppose I now want to bring this to a conclusion. That's my realistic assessment of where we are here in the UK and where we are globally. And we can obviously go to all sorts of other places to consider comparisons. China, for instance, is interesting, but if you think China's done any of its economic recovery investments via the green economy, think again, because it hasn't. How is all this going to change? And that's my last little bit I want to just touch on. Well, we need to keep up the business pressure on this. We need progressive companies that really are seized of the full challenge of what net zero by X looks like, and are taking it seriously through science-based targets, through proper action planning, through real hard-edged measures to get those emissions done. And we need increasingly, in my opinion, and this is something I touch on at great length in the book, In Hope in Hell, we're going to have to see a continuation of the kind of political pressure that a lot of politicians don't like, which will be much more direct pressure from campaigners, much more civil disobedience, and much more pressure coming from young climate activists who I can assure you will be regaining their mojo come 2021. Interesting that even as we're organizing this Green Recovery Festival, young people all around the world are involved in something called Mock COP26, which is bringing together delegates, I think it's now from 70 countries around the world, looking at what young people expect of their governments from the perspective of a fully fledged recovery program. And the contrast between what is likely to emerge from that by the end of the week and what emerged from number 10 yesterday could not be starker. So we've got a long way to go. And although I have sought at every turn to remain very hopeful about the ability of our politicians to seize this moment, to narrow the gap between what the science tells us about accelerating climate change and where we are politically, maintaining hope in that space isn't easy. And one really has to work at it these days, given the continuing reluctance of most politicians genuinely to seize hold of this in the right way. I'll stop there, Caroline. I hope that has offered significant, or at least sufficient provocation to get a few questions flowing.
Gosh, thank you so much, Jonathan. That's great, and I think it's a really good analysis of the of Boris's 10-point plan for people who might not have got up to speed with it. So depressing, but fantastic analysis. Thank you. Yeah, I was going to ask you about any good examples in terms of economic blueprints from various governments around the world, but you already said that it was quite hard to find real leadership from any governments. So instead, I suppose you mentioned that it's a responsibility of business to do practical things based on science-based targets, and the responsibility of others to mobilize in terms of political pressure. But I feel like that maybe is the danger there that you get into silos of, you know, businesses doing their thing versus campaigners doing their thing? And from your experience, what do effective business civil society partnerships look like, or even business civil society and government partnerships look like?
I'm not worried about that, Caroline. I must admit, you know, we set up Forum for the Future back in 1996, and I'm not saying we were unique in those days, but there was mighty little partnership-based work between civil society and the corporate world, certainly between the more radical end of civil society and the corporate world. I look around me now and there's an extraordinary flourishing of civil society business type partnerships and relationships of one kind or another. And it's a hugely important part of the mix. It really is. Everywhere I look, this is adding to what different organizations can achieve on their own. I don't think government really understands that at the moment. I don't think they've got a proper handle on the depth of partnering that's already going on around the world. I think internationally, UN agencies understand this and are getting much more agile in terms of seeing how they can deliver the Sustainable Development Goals, for instance, via hybrid models involving the private sector and civil society. And that has to be hugely welcomed. So I think that bit works okay. And for me, it comes down to practicalities. So yesterday in the 10-point plan, Boris didn't mention solar power at all. But we know that actually the solar industry in the UK is a huge surprise to an awful lot of people because they're not accustomed to thinking of the UK and sunshine all in the same breath, as it were. But we're doing brilliantly well on solar panels and solar installations in general in the UK. The Solar Trade Association put out a rather plaintive press release at the end of yesterday saying, so what's wrong with you, Boris? Where has your perspective gone on this? You mentioned offshore wind again. You didn't actually mention onshore wind, which is stupid because actually onshore wind is coming back into play next year. It'll be included in the bidding process, the contracts for difference. And there was no mention of solar. But we could be getting 30 gigawatts of onshore wind and 30 gigawatts of solar to add to our 40 gigawatts of offshore wind if we had a government that actually understood the potential of this. Boris couldn't get it out there, but yesterday we had a couple of announcements from companies indicating that one of the things they can do now is go for their own self-generation of solar-based electricity to deliver in part on their net zero commitments. And that's what I mean by practicalities. To a certain extent, get on out there and make those investments deliver in practice what ministers can prattle on about in theory.
Thank you. Right, I'm going to turn to some of the questions. We've got lots of questions flooding in for you. If you are asking questions via Zoom, please pop them in the Q&A box. If you're asking questions through our social media streams, then just use the hashtag #TheCrowd and the hashtag Jonathon Porritt, and we'll pick them up for you. So who should we go to first? We've got a question about, where's it gone? The Committee on Climate Change, who has been quite positive about the plan, including meeting the carbon budget. What would you say to them? And then a different question, which is around how can individual businesses condense large, wide-ranging climate plans and principles into their own smaller scale business strategies? So, so probably one short answer and one long answer, I think.
Well, the Committee on Climate Change, I feel for them, you know, they are an independent body, but they can't be too nasty about government because otherwise ministers take the hump and don't listen to them as much as we need them to. And of course, yesterday, because I've already touched on this from a transport point of view, yesterday was good. And the Committee on Climate Change has identified transport-related emissions as the biggest challenge that we have to deal with. So it wasn't a bad outcome for the Committee on Climate Change, that combination of phase out of the internal combustion engine plus investments in better facilities, promotion of cycling, walking. So that was quite good. And that will genuinely help to drive down emissions from the transport sector. So they're entitled to being a little bit chuffed about what happened yesterday. They haven't had time to decipher in any detail. Actually, that's an unfair ask because there's absolutely nothing which they can decipher in any detail at the moment. But the rest of it, as I say, maybe they just decided to park that and say nice things about the bits that really were substantive from their point of view, which is fair enough. The story about what companies can do, again, I think I did touch on that really. It does come down to not relying on these big grandstanding target setting declarations as a substitute for action. So I'm deeply suspicious about net zero commitments by 2050. I haven't talked at all about the science of climate change this morning because I'm imagining we've got an audience that is predominantly up to speed on all of this. And one only needs to say, halve emissions by 2030, otherwise we're unlikely to get on track for what we need to do by 2050, which means we won't be on track for what we need to do by the end of the century, which means we'll be tripping all of these climate thresholds as we go through average temperature increases 1.52, 2.53, and the apocalypse then looms. So you all get that. That is the path we're on. That is our current trajectory. So pretty much everything depends on what we get done by 2030, not by 2050. So I'm now really mean and unpleasant with all the partners that we have in Forum for the Future, who somehow might still expect a little bit of a sort of pat on the head from net carbon zero plans by 2050. And we're just simply saying it's irrelevant. It means literally nothing. You have got to work out two milestones. One, what are you going to get done by 2030? And what is the contribution that will make to a longer term target? And when are you going to deliver on that net zero target? And please don't come back with 2050 as your answer to that question. So for me, in reality, these two milestones are 2030 and 2040. And good climate planning now inside all companies should have those two timeframes as their targets. That's what they should be working to. I'll allow you a little bit of residual space between 2040 and 2050 to do some good planning around nature-based climate solutions, some of the harder stuff, because going net zero isn't going to be easy for everybody, but really and truly the hard end of this, the science-based side of this, is just in those two timeframes, 2030 and 2040.
And does any of that advice change in terms of SMEs and the scale of organisations? We've had a question around what advice you give SMEs to embrace climate change.
Yeah, this is really much harder, Caroline, and you're right. And thank you for the question. It reminds me yet again that I have focused almost exclusively on what big companies can do, and because this is the work that Forum does, mostly multinational companies. And I'm very conscious every time someone reminds me of it, that that is not quite such an easy ask for a lot of SMEs. And one of the things that we do increasingly is to ask our partners, what are they doing to help their supply chain? Often there are many, many more SMEs in their supply chains. What are they doing to make it easier for SMEs to match the climate ambition of the larger companies? Because it isn't as easy as that. The gains are just as great. If you actually look at the statistics about the degree to which investment in energy efficiency, for instance, enhances performance, competitiveness, cost saving, etc. for SMEs, it's at least as good a story as anything that you get for big companies. But finding the time, setting aside what might be quite limited resources, capex, to do what needs to be done, all of these things in very hard-pressed SMEs, often struggling in the economy today, is not easy. And it worries me that there's not much focus on that from BEIS, from the business department either. It's an assumption that somehow SMEs will struggle their way towards a good outcome without very much help from anywhere else. So it's a big part of it.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a question from Jennifer Clark. So thanks for that, Jennifer. We've got a couple of questions around aviation. Stuart Green asked about just your general thoughts on aviation's efforts to address sustainability and environmental performance. Someone else asked about insights on the Jet Zero commitment and if there's any useful resources or action planning behind this.
Good question. And I can be a bit less mean about government on this, because actually the Jet Zero Council that the government is setting up is good. It's really useful. And it it really is beginning to get a different quality of response from a sector which, let's be honest, has been utterly dire. And we know that because aviation and shipping were exempted many years ago from the Kyoto Protocol, they took that as an excuse to do as little as they could possibly get away with for as many years as possible. And that's what has allowed them to remain pretty detached from the whole climate debate until people started painfully reminding them that as one of the biggest carbon growth sectors, as in carbon footprint increasing year on year, that wasn't likely to be a sustainable position. The last 9 months has probably seen more creative thinking and resolute application of alternatives to the use of jet fuel in aviation than I've seen in the preceding, certainly 9 years and possibly even 20 years. And people really are beginning, in the industry now, are really focused on the fact that their industry is going to be slow to recover anyway. And just the emergence of some vaccines in our life in 2021 does not mean aviation will be back to 6% per annum growth, because it won't for a long time to come. Most people reckon not until 2022, if then. So this is an industry that knows it's on a different kind of trajectory now and needs to think very carefully about how it's going to build trust with consumers post-COVID. And that will entail very specific commitments around their own decarbonization trajectories. What are they going to do about that? Now, again, governments could be much smarter here. Lots of airlines are getting bailed out. As of now, very few of those airlines have been told that they will only get government money if they commit much more aggressively to decarbonization strategies. We, for instance, would like to see a minimum fuel mandate imposed on every airline that gets any taxpayers' money. So no taxpayers' money unless you commit not to compete on routes that are best served by trains, and you commit to guaranteeing that 5% of the total fuel use that you have will be delivered using sustainable aviation fuels by a given date in the future. Governments are so stupid. They've got a unique opportunity to impose conditionality of that kind. Of course, those companies are going to take the money with conditions like that, because otherwise they're in such trouble. So for me, this is a really important time for the industry. And I say this because they're going to have to step up. The leadership that is going to be asked of these industries, of these companies now in the industry, is very, very different from the kind of leadership that we had before.
We've had a couple of questions on other sectors and industries. So someone who is choosing to remain anonymous has been asking about the effects of the animal agriculture industry on the 2030 target. Tom Schuller has asked whether you're completely opposed to small modular nuclear units as a necessary bridge. And Alexander McLean Bristol has asked about what you feel about BP's announcement that it's moving. Where's the question gone? Someone's liked it, and so it's gone from my about BP's announcement that it's moving from being an oil company to an integrated energy company. Yeah. Is this a step in the right direction? So any thoughts on any of those more specific questions?
Well, yes. We all know that the whole land-based side of the climate story is constantly underestimated by governments and disregarded. You saw that in the 10-point plan. No mention of what we need to do to bring agriculture and food production into a low-carbon age. Simple headline here: we need massively to reduce the amount of protein that we derive from animal-based sources, whether that's terrestrial or marine sources. That means we're going to move towards a predominantly plant-based alternative economy in that regard, which will have huge implications for land use and potentially a massive upside in terms of opportunities to use land differently and in ways that capture CO2 from the atmosphere. So there's massive upside there. Governments have got to start getting as confident about that as they think they are on other aspects. Small modular reactors, not so small, by the way. The small modular reactor that Rolls-Royce is now out there proselytizing on behalf of is about 440 megawatts, which is the size of the average Magnox reactor. So not a little bit of kit that you can stack away in some pocket park in the middle of a big conurbation. And I am completely unpersuaded by the proposition here, because there is no order book for any small modular reactors at the moment. They're going to be very costly. They're going to have exactly the same problems in terms of supply chains, waste issues, security issues, public concern issues, because ideally they need to be sited quite close to concentrations of people so you can use the heat from those SMRs. So for me, it's an irrelevance, but sadly, this is a industry that manages to keep its interests in government alive. If you want my full explanation for that, it's because the government can't do what it needs to do in the defense industry without having a very active supply chain of talent for the nuclear industries in general. We have a nuclear civil capability because we have to prop up our defense capability. That's the simple reason for it. And there's some brilliant work on that that's been done by Steve Sterling at Sussex University. So that brings me to BP very quickly. I've been a bit mean about BP in the past. I must admit now that the absolutely explicit commitment to become an integrated energy company rather than a hydrocarbon-based company, to write off billions of pounds worth of assets in their hydrocarbon business, and to commit to sourcing as much of their future profitability as they possibly can from renewables and integrated energy solutions. These are for real. And I think we can now say that BP is showing the sort of leadership which it so signally failed to provide 10 years ago, at a time when Forum did work with BP and completely failed to, amongst others, failed to persuade BP to do what Bernard Looney, now the CEO, seems to be moving towards. So I haven't completely now given up on BP. I'm pretty pissed off about Shell, by the way, whose adverts are all over the media at the moment. I mean, really disgustingly hypocritical advertising campaign, utter greenwash, with lots of nice looking people saying how much they care about a future based on renewable energy and efficiency and smart grids and so on. Not a single reference to what Shell really does, which is to go on extracting those hydrocarbons that threaten the life on Earth of every single human being. So that stuff, the fact that it still goes on, shows that these companies just don't get it yet.
Thank you. Right, I've got lots of more questions to get through. I think there's a bundle of questions that are probably best described as sort of going local. So Talk Action has asked, you've mentioned 2030 and 2040 as key dates. The NDCs, which will be a big focus for COP26, are about 5 years to 2025. So is there a value in looking to encourage locally determined contributions from businesses, cities, etc., within that shorter time frame? Richard Bolden has asked about the limitations of national government in responding to the climate emergency. So what do you think about the role of local government and communities in leading on this agenda, and any good examples? And Michael has also asked about giving communities a stake in the net zero transition rather than it being imposed on them by governments and big organizations. And again, are there any examples of where this has been done well?
Thank you. Huge supporter of stuff happening at local scale, particularly at city level. I do think that city regions in general are going to become a really crucial part in delivering low carbon prosperity for people. And we're beginning to see those cities flex their muscles a bit. I think at the last count, I'm trying to recall, I think it's something like 85, it might be as high as 90% of local authorities have now declared a climate emergency. Can it really be that high? Anyway, it's a very significant percentage of local authorities have now committed themselves to addressing this as an emergency. They don't yet have the action planning in place to do that, but that is a start. There's so much that could be happening there, and I'm really interested in some of this new financing story for local government in particular. Community municipal investments, CMIs as they're called. We've seen some really intriguing examples over the last few months in places like Warrington and West Berkshire, where those municipalities, those local governments are actually raising green bonds to enable them to make investments in, say, roof-mounted solar installations for their schools and things like this, and make it possible for local citizens in those places to invest in local assets of that kind. We could be doing so much more of this. It's very practical, it's very hands-on. People love it. They can walk past the places where they've helped to put an investment on the roof of a school, whatever it may be. This is very much part of the future, and we've been slow to get onto it, but it is going to be really important. So I think the local dimension is really critical. For me, I don't actually think that anybody is having things dumped on them. If I think, for instance, about the signal that government has now given on phasing out petrol and diesel vehicles, I do hope that every single company on this call has understood the implications of that for whatever they might have by way of their fleet management policy. Most companies still have a fleet management, car management policy of one kind or another. So get ahead of the curve. How quickly are you going to be able to phase out any remaining petrol and diesel vehicles in the models that you still make available, either directly or through the grey fleet, whatever it might be? And I know this, I'm a non-executive director of a company called Wilmot Dixon, and we've just revised our fleet strategy. We have a lot of vans whizzing around as much as anything else. And I'm not saying we're brilliantly perspicacious in this regard, but you can see the direction of travel. So obviously you have to go on tightening those schemes. And every single large company on this call, first useful thing you could do is get after whoever it is that runs that side of your procurement. Remind them now of what the reality looks like. Get ahead of this curve while you've still got time to do it, and make some really timely decisions based on that.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a question from Peter Jones. Should there not have been a one-point plan to switch the base of government funding from incomes and consumption onto taxation of carbon, pollution emissions, resource consumption, and producer responsibility? And I suppose that links to a slightly wider question, which is, who pays for it all? What do you think?
If that's the Peter Jones I know, then I understand where that question is coming from. I guess I'm a bit baffled by our Chancellor, by Rishi Sunak. I mean, he's tends at the moment to be defaulting back to what I can only describe as austerity mindsets, as in we're running out of money and this isn't going to be easy, and therefore we're not going to be able to do all of these amazing things that we ought to do to create all the new jobs that we need, because we're going to have to attend to the finances and restore integrity in our finances before we can actually get the economy back up on its feet again. And I'm very worried by this, incidentally, because I fear that he may be an Austerian who has currently hidden that particular aspect of his mindset under the shining light that he's cast on his generosity during COVID-19. That would be a massive mistake. But if I was Rishi Sunak, I would be having a really lively discussion at the moment about carbon taxes. This is a government that is going to need additional tax revenues. I think they're thinking about the role of taxation is pretty limited, by the way, but they're certainly going to need to find additional tax revenues. And the obvious place to go is to drive carbon taxation or carbon pricing really hard, to do it now, while everybody understands that we have to move towards this low carbon trajectory for 2030, to phase it in so that it isn't too punitive to begin with, but make each annual increment really punitive. So by the time we get to 2030, we would be paying a minimum of $100 to $120 a ton of carbon here in the UK economy, and possibly even more. Just like phasing out the internal combustion engine, you have to phase in market instruments that give wealth creators the signals they need to make the right longer term decisions. If you don't do that now, if you suddenly spring it on people, look what happened when Macron tried to do that with his attempts to deal with the les gilets jaunes and all the rest of it. So do it now. And I'm surprised that he hasn't started a good debate on that, because you'd want to get the hard nuts in the Tory party at least a little bit prepared for what is going to be a very uncomfortable decision for them.
Thank you. Okay, we've got a whole batch of questions around advocacy, lobbying government and activism. So Oliver asks about how both industry and academia can be engaging with government to convince them to invest properly, specifically in green hydrogen. An anonymous attendee says, I was part of the 2030 petrol diesel ban consultation. How can I make my voice heard as an activist next to large businesses and larger NGOs when it comes to these plans and consultations? Jamie from Restless Development says, on your point regarding young climate activists, what tools and strategies can young people employ to continue pressuring governments to be bolder, similarly to the MOC26 activities? And Matt from JLL asks, if we assume governments represent the people, do organisations, especially those committed to net zero, have a responsibility to encourage their employees to apply pressure to their politicians?
On effective advocacy, I think that there is already a pretty effective advocacy lobby around green hydrogen, and I think they did a reasonably good job. I think they'll be a bit disappointed with the outcome, because actually this is one area where we really need a fully fledged government private sector collaboration, and it shouldn't be worrying about frippery issues to do with a hydrogen neighborhood or a hydrogen town. It should be focusing on how do we get these production facilities properly set up, how do we create the opportunities so we can use that green hydrogen most effectively in different parts of the industrial, hard to abate economy. So that advocacy, I think, has worked well, but it didn't quite get as far as it needs to, but you can see where that will all go in future. In terms of individual voices in this area, that is a really hard call. I mean, it's enormously difficult to think that one's going to have much influence, frankly, on these big debates. But the person who asked that question said they were involved in the phasing out of the petrol and diesel vehicles by 2030. So good job, frankly, because that seems to have landed in one way or another. On the young climate activist side of it, if I may come onto that one, the story for me is how quickly we will see those young people's movements, school strikes and so on, bounce back in 2021. And I don't doubt it will. I'm doing quite a lot of work with some of those young climate activist groups at the moment, and just watching how hard a year it's been for them in 2020. And it has been really a seriously tough year for them. But none of their passion, concern, anger has gone away. It's all there still, even though 2020 has been what they see as a lost year pretty much. And I think in 2021, we'll see a lot of that come back. My warning to people here is, at the moment, you may not have properly cottoned on to what I see as an emerging cry of intergenerational rage, as more and more young people understand the true extent of how we have undermined their prospects for a good future. You should anticipate that the anger will intensify and the numbers of people sharing that anger will grow and grow every year. And that's quite a little message there for people in business. Lastly, what to do about one's employees. The journeys I love are when companies not only understand what they need to do within their own scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 type of trajectories, but how can they engage with their own employees to make it easier for them to do what they need to do in terms of their own climate obligations and responsibilities. And the good companies that are doing that now, really important as examples for others to follow. It all comes down to what Al Gore used to talk about. He used to talk very simply about choice, voice, and vote. Choice, so that every decision you take is a choice. You go one way or the other way. Whatever you do, you've ruled out doing anything else. So every choice you make needs to be mindful of the climate emergency. Voice, so that you speak up whenever you possibly can, around the water cooler, in the pub, wouldn't that be nice? With family, because often that's a hard place to go. Wherever you can, get this voice out there, get people used to it. And then the vote bit, which is get stuck into the politics of this, because if we don't do the politics, I can assure you we will not be halving our emissions by 2030.
Jonathan, thank you so much. I think that's all we've got time for, but you've covered such a wide range of issues and ideas. So thank you. We're really grateful for those insights and experiences. Thank you very much to everyone who has joined us and asked questions today, whether that's on Zoom or via one of our streaming places on Twitter and YouTube and so on. The Green Recovery Festival is a series of events. I mentioned we're sort of almost halfway through the fortnight. And we've got a number of other events this afternoon and next week. And beyond the festival, if you're interested in finding out what we have planned for 2021, including our activities around COP26, get in touch with myself or a colleague at the crowd. But once again, thank you very much to everyone for joining us. And thank you, Jonathan. That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you for joining us.